that only handouts and feelings were in her housing plan. Within 96 hours, Karoline's smirk vanished. Her donors fled, her team fractured, and the media turned. What she didn't know? Jasmine had spent 11 months crafting a groundbreaking housing proposal built on hard data and real families' voices. When Jasmine released it, she didn't destroy Karoline. She made her irrelevant. So the question is, what exactly did Jasmine Crockett do that made Congress and the country finally listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blazing lights of a Capitol Hill studio, the countdown hit 0. "We're live," a voice crackled in the control room. Millions were watching. The segment was called "The Federal Fight: Who's Failing the Homeless?" A primetime debate on post-pandemic housing policy. At center stage sat two women, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, eyes calm, suit crisp, presence steady, and across from her, Karoline Leavitt, younger, smirking, perfectly rehearsed. The moderator barely finished her opening line before Karoline leaned forward, seizing the first strike like a predator spotting weakness. "Let's just be real for a second," Karoline said, voice sweet but blade sharp underneath. "Congresswoman Crockett seems to think poverty is just a budget problem, that if we hand out enough checks, the crisis disappears." She smiled, not at Jasmine, but at the viewers. "It's like trying to fix a broken roof by throwing money at the rain. Honestly, if that's your solution," she added, eyes locked in, "maybe it's time you brushed up on some basic economics." There was a beat, just one, but it echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. The moderator's eyes flicked to Jasmine, nervous now, sensing the storm. Somewhere off camera, a producer mouthed, "Oh God," but Jasmine didn't blink. No eye roll, no smirk. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't even sit forward. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and direct. "I don't need to relearn theory, Miss Leavitt," she said, soft, but without an inch of weakness. "I spend most days talking to people who live what textbooks leave out." Another pause, and then, "I fix what theory forgot." The sentence landed like a scalpel, precise, bloodless, devastating. Not a clap, not a cough. The audience froze, caught between shame and awe. Karoline blinked, lips parting as if to retort, but no words came. Even the moderator hesitated before speaking again, thrown by the shifting gravity. In less than 10 seconds, the momentum had shifted, and no one watching could quite explain how. The camera zoomed in on Jasmine. No anger, no smugness. Just that look, like someone who had seen the fire, walked through it, and now watched others pretend they knew heat. Behind the scenes, Twitter lit up. Producers scrambled for new graphics. Studio staff exchanged glances. But on stage, it was war in slow motion. Karoline had come armed with zingers and applause lines. Jasmine had brought something else, something quieter, deadlier. She was playing a different game, a longer one, and the entire room could feel it. The studio lights faded, but Jasmine didn't need a stage to keep fighting. The real work didn't happen in sound bites. It happened in silence, behind closed doors, when no one was watching. She walked out of the building without a single word to the cameras, her heels tapping sharp against the marble, echoing like gunshots in the empty corridor. Staffers rushed behind her, heads bowed to phones, tweets flying like shrapnel from the fire Karoline had lit. But Jasmine wasn't interested in fighting fire with fire. She stepped into the black sedan waiting outside, tossed her blazer in the seat next to her, and closed the door like closing a vault. The ride back to the hotel was silent. She didn't speak, didn't scroll. Her aide Liana glanced over once, but thought better of saying anything. Jasmine stared out the window, face unreadable, but eyes calculating, not angry, just focused, like someone who'd taken a punch and already knew how to end the fight without swinging back. By the time they reached the hotel, the sky had darkened. Reporters were still buzzing outside, flashing lights bouncing off the tinted glass like sparks off steel. Jasmine ignored them. No hand wave, no comment. She moved quickly through the side entrance, past the concierge who nodded respectfully, but wisely said nothing. Inside her room, the air was still, the furniture untouched since morning. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes and sat at the desk. The hum of the mini fridge, the faint creak of the air vent, those were the only sounds. Then she opened her laptop. The screen came alive instantly. Not social media, not news alerts. Just one file blinking at her like an unfinished weapon. Federal Housing Equity Reform Draft V22. She started typing. Edits, revisions, notes from the last listening tour in Mississippi, quotes from a single mother in Detroit who worked 2 jobs but still lived in a car with her 2 sons, a statistic about 43,000 veterans waiting on housing vouchers. Line by line, she rebuilt what the system had broken. Her fingers moved fast, steady, relentless. This wasn't a clapback. This was a blueprint, a rebuttal that didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't write to impress Karoline. She wrote to bury her in facts. Liana knocked softly and stepped in, holding a sandwich she knew Jasmine wouldn't eat. "They're already clipping the debate," she said, setting it down. "Karoline's trending. Again." Jasmine didn't look up. Her voice came low and even. "Let her." Liana paused. "You're not going to respond? Not even one post?" Jasmine stopped typing just long enough to breathe in slowly. Then she said, "Everyone thinks I'm silent because I lost." Her fingers hovered over the keys. "But I'm building something they don't even have the tools to measure yet." She leaned back, eyes tired but alive, shoulders firm. "They want sound bites. I'm giving them structure." Liana nodded but didn't reply. She'd seen this before. Jasmine wasn't retreating. She was loading. Every hour Karoline spent celebrating was another page added to something far more dangerous than a headline. A fully formed policy plan grounded in data, testimony, and unshakable truth. The kind of thing that didn't trend, but stuck. The kind of thing that couldn't be spun because it came from the mouths of people the system forgot. Jasmine knew what Karoline didn't. The public could be distracted, but not forever. And when the noise died down, all that would be left was the work. At exactly 5:03 a.m., the hotel room was quiet in that fragile way rooms feel before something historic happens. Outside, Providence was still dark. Barely a car on the streets, just the occasional flicker of a traffic light changing for no one. Inside, Jasmine Crockett sat barefoot at the desk, wrapped in a plain gray sweatshirt, a legal pad full of scribbled notes beside her, a lukewarm cup of tea untouched on the nightstand. Her laptop cast a faint glow across her face, but it wasn't the light of distraction. It was the light of decision. The file sat on the screen, open but still unsent. Federal Housing Equity Reform Act, Draft V22. The title was clinical. The contents were not. Every paragraph, every bullet point had been carved from 11 months of field visits, late-night calls, folded testimonies from single mothers and caseworkers, policy memos she'd rewritten herself when staffers said it was too ambitious. There were no talking points here, no quotes engineered for applause, just raw evidence, and the quiet fury of someone who had seen too much suffering explained away by people in suits. She scrolled one last time, not because she was unsure, but because she knew this wasn't just a document. It was a mirror, one that would force Congress, media, and bureaucrats to look directly at what they'd chosen to ignore. Charts laid bare where the money had gone and where it hadn't. Receipts showed the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. There were names, dates, cities. A mother in Cleveland who waited 14 months for a voucher while city council members voted to expand a baseball stadium. A veteran in Dallas who died on a shelter waiting list while 3 departments blamed each other. None of this was abstract. This wasn't policy, it was people. And Jasmine had made sure every one of them was heard. She added no headline, no bold font, no dramatic closing. But at the very end, on its own line, she left one sentence, not italicized, not underlined, just sitting there like a blade. You've had the money, you've had the mandate. What you haven't had is the will. She sat back in her chair, arms heavy, fingers stiff from typing straight through the night. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from staying open too long. She didn't stretch. She didn't exhale. She just looked at the screen, then to the clock. 5:03 a.m. With a slow, steady hand, She opened the email draft she had built in silence. No speech, no press release, no grand opening line. Only a list of names, carefully chosen, handpicked, some of whom had never returned her calls before. Key policy staffers, editors at 3 major papers, senior aides in both parties, directors at urban housing institutes who'd once said she was too emotional to talk data. She included them all. Every name on that list had, at one point or another, helped stall, soften, or bury real reform. The subject line was left blank. The attachment was titled simply, "The Work They Refuse to Do." And then she clicked send. No fireworks, no music, just a quiet digital confirmation. Message sent. 5:03 a.m. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't lean back like a hero in the final act. She just stared at the screen for a moment longer. She knew what she had just done. Not thrown a punch, but dropped an anvil. This wasn't about Karoline Leavitt anymore. This wasn't about a debate or a viral clip. This was a line in the sand. No one could say they didn't know anymore. Not after this. If they ignored it now, they'd have to explain why. She slowly closed the laptop, the sound of the hinge folding down like a book snapping shut. The room was still dark, the sky outside just starting to shift to a dull gray. Jasmine stood, rubbed the stiffness from her shoulder, and walked to the window. There were no crowds, no flashbulbs, just a parking lot, a breeze, and the distant sound of delivery trucks starting their day. But what she had just sent out would move faster than any of them. It was out now. Unstoppable. Unavoidable. Undeniable. And the world wouldn't know it yet. Not until it was already too late to ignore. By the time Jasmine finally closed her eyes, the file had already begun its quiet invasion, slipping past gatekeepers, skipping inbox hierarchies, and landing where it was least expected, in the hands of people who could no longer pretend not to know. It started small. A policy analyst at the Philadelphia Inquirer opened the file at 6:47 a.m., intending to skim it. By 7:12, she had forwarded it to the editorial board with a subject line that simply read, "You need to see this now." At 8:03, an assistant producer at Face the Nation printed the last 12 pages and left them on her executive producer's desk, circled in red. By 9 a.m., the document was bouncing between congressional inboxes like a ricochet bullet, first among interns, then senior aides, then chiefs of staff who hadn't even had coffee yet. No one had expected it, and that was the point. While DC obsessed over who won a soundbite war the night before, Jasmine had loaded the truth and fired it without warning. By 10 a.m., the ripple had become a wave. The Washington Post ran a headline that made seasoned strategists sit up straighter. A quiet bill with loud implications. Crockett's plan upends the narrative. The article didn't sensationalize. It didn't need to. It simply laid out what Jasmine had done. No press conference, no grandstanding, no media rollout. Just policy, sent cold, and it was working. Politico followed with a summary breakdown. Vox called it surgical. On Twitter, the hashtag Crockett receipts climbed past trending celebrity gossip and broke into the top 3 by 10:34 a.m. Beneath it, screenshots of the PDF were being dissected like classified intelligence. Users highlighted phrases like intentionally defunded pathways and budgeted neglect. Some posted their own housing horror stories, tagging their representatives. The silence Jasmine had held the night before was now being filled by the people. Panic settled in Karoline Leavitt's team like fog over cold ground. Her comms director, Seth, burst into her office mid-call, holding a printout. "It's everywhere," he said, not even trying to hide the shake in his voice. Karoline barely looked up. "What? That file?" she scoffed. "It's just another emotional dump. People get worked up, then they move on." But she was wrong, and somewhere deep down, she could feel it. Still, when CNN called requesting a response, she agreed. 15 minutes later, under studio lights, she sat composed, smug again, lips sharpened like she thought they still mattered. "Let's not confuse feelings with function," she said to the anchor. "It's easy to write with emotion. That doesn't make it policy." She paused for effect, waited for the host to nod. But they didn't. They were already flipping through printed pages of the bill on their lap. And across America, those watching weren't buying the act anymore. The applause line had expired, and the receipts were in. By early afternoon, Washington, D.C. no longer felt like a city of power. It felt like a pressure cooker seconds from blowing. The confirmation from Reuters had struck like lightning. Blunt, cold, irrefutable. The title of the article alone sent tremors through Capitol Hill. Crockett's housing proposal, fully verified, no inaccuracies found. Inside, it was clinical, brutal. Reuters had gone line by line, chart by chart, budget footnote by footnote. Veterans, voucher backlogs, urban-rural funding disparities, case data from 17 states. Every claim Jasmine Crockett had made in her proposal was verified against federal records, internal memos, and state housing reports. Not one correction issued, no overreach, no spin, just reality, raw and defenseless. The article spread across offices like smoke through an old vent system. Hill staffers, journalists, policy analysts, they didn't even forward it. They slacked it, texted it, whispered it in the halls between meetings. You could feel it even in the lobbies of the Senate buildings, where aides leaned over coffee counters, reading the article out loud to each other with eyebrows raised and mouths half open. One Democratic strategist muttered under his breath, "She didn't just come prepared, she came armed." And for the first time in weeks, even those who had ignored Jasmine's emails began wondering if they'd underestimated a woman who never once raised her voice, but had just broken the noise. But that wasn't the worst of it. For Karoline, the collapse was just beginning. At 1:43 p.m., a user on a small policy watchdog forum posted something seemingly innocuous. Wait, didn't Leavitt vote against a housing amendment just like this last year? 10 minutes later, the internet had proof. A digital screenshot of a public record pulled straight from the legislative archives. H.R. 2157, Affordable Housing Access Revision Act, Committee Vote 2023. Leavitt, nay. The same policy framework, the same funding mechanism. In fact, the bill had even shared language Jasmine had expanded in her own draft. Back then, Karoline had dismissed it as overregulation with no fiscal spine. Now she was on national television calling Jasmine's version overly emotional. The contrast wasn't just striking, it was damning. The receipts were now on both sides of the aisle. Within the hour, screenshots of the roll call vote appeared alongside Jasmine's proposal on Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. The meme machine activated instantly. One half of the screen showed Karoline mocking Jasmine on live TV. The other half showed her nay vote from last year, stamped in red. Hashtags exploded. Crockett receipts became receipts and roll calls. One user posted, "Jasmine brought the truth. Karoline brought the contradiction." And it was only getting worse. That evening, during a segment on CNN's Crossfire Weekly, longtime analyst Hector Barnes leaned forward in his chair, glasses low on his nose, holding a physical printout of the Reuters article in one hand and Karoline's 2023 vote record in the other. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He just looked directly at the camera and said, "Leavitt lit the match. Crockett ended the fire with facts." The studio fell quiet. Even the conservative panelist, a usual firebrand, offered no rebuttal. The host nodded slowly. The quote hit Twitter in seconds, and within 15 minutes, "End it with facts" trended alongside Jasmine's original tag. Meanwhile, Karoline sat in the green room of a podcast studio in Arlington, surrounded by silence thicker than the makeup caking under the lights. Her phone buzzed on the armrest. It was Seth. Again. Reuters confirmed everything. You need to stop calling it soft. No emoji, no punctuation, just urgency. She read it and said nothing. Her reflection in the makeup mirror looked less like a rising star and more like someone realizing the script she'd rehearsed all week had turned to ash. Her eyes darted to the TV behind her. The chyron read, "Crockett's plan verified. Leavitt's pass vote resurfaces." She looked down again. The file in her lap felt heavier now. She hadn't even opened it. It was Jasmine's bill, printed out, stapled, annotated by her comms team. She had mocked it on instinct, dismissed it because she assumed it was hollow. But now she could feel it pulsing beneath her fingers like a live wire. There were no talking points that could erase a public record, no charm that could spin math, no smirk that could outmaneuver someone who had stayed silent and let the facts speak. And Jasmine? She still hadn't said a word. Just when Karoline thought the storm might settle, the real explosion hit, not from a rival, but from a careless truth whispered behind closed doors and dragged into daylight. It began with 47 seconds. No intro, no watermark, just a low hum of background chatter, wine glasses clinking, then the unmistakable sharpness of Karoline Leavitt's voice. Clear, confident, and catastrophically reckless. They don't read the bills, that crowd, please. Give them a few slogans, a couple of punchlines, and they're good for the week. There was a pause in the audio. Just laughter. Not the nervous kind. The entitled kind. The kind that only happens when people believe the cameras are off and power is permanent. A man in the background chuckled and said something unintelligible, to which Karoline responded, still laughing. We're out here pretending they care about policy. Most of them can't even fill out a benefits form without help. That was the match. The clip dropped online at 10:08 a.m. the next morning. An anonymous Twitter account with no followers, no bio, just one post. This is what she really thinks of voters. The retweets came in slow at first. Then came the verification from two journalists at ProPublica and Politico. The audio matched her voice. The location, a closed-door donor dinner in Charleston 2 weeks earlier. And by noon, the clip had racked up 3.2 million views and become a five-alarm inferno. Newsrooms scrambled to confirm. The Hill ran the headline, Leavitt's private mockery of voters sparks national backlash. CNN cut into regular programming to play the clip. Twice. On MSNBC, Joy Reid leaned in and said, "This isn't just arrogance. This is contempt with a microphone." Fox News surprisingly didn't defend her. Even they couldn't. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't trending. It didn't have to be. Everyone knew who she was now by comparison, and she hadn't said a single word. Karoline's inner circle went into lockdown. Her press secretary canceled all interviews within 20 minutes. Donors started ghosting before the hour was out. One PAC publicly withdrew a $400,000 commitment, citing a difference in values. 3 more followed. An anonymous aide leaked a screenshot of the campaign Slack thread. "We are bleeding support. Anyone got a lifeboat?" Her political mentor in Connecticut issued a carefully worded statement about the need for respectful tone. Another congressman, one she'd campaigned beside just last month, simply unfollowed her on Twitter and locked his account. The betrayal hadn't come from a scandal dug up by opposition researchers. It had come from her own voice, dripping with the kind of elitist detachment people fear exists in every politician. The kind of voice that confirms the worst suspicions of voters across America. That some of them, the ones in power, don't just disagree with the people, they despise them. By 2 p.m., hashtags like Slogan Queen, they can't read, and Mockery Leavitt blanketed social media. Parents posted videos of their kids holding up signs that said, "I may not be a policy expert, but I'm not stupid." Veterans reposted screenshots of Karoline's old campaign ads alongside the audio. One caption read, "Thanks for the slogan. I'll remember it on Election Day." Journalists reached out for comment. Her office released a dry, 3-sentence statement claiming the recording was taken out of context, but no one bought it. The tone was too clear, the intent too naked. Even her campaign manager looked exhausted by sunset. In a leaked voicemail to a donor, he could be heard saying, "She might survive this in one piece, but not in the same seat." And Jasmine? Still no tweet, no press conference, no leaked memo. Just a quiet presence in the background, as the country that Karoline mocked began to turn. At 4:15 p.m., a coalition of local activists, housing advocates, and civic leaders released a letter titled, "We read the bills, we live them." It was signed by over 300 organizations, many of which had testified for or against housing reforms over the years. The language wasn't inflammatory, it was surgical. It highlighted the contrast between someone who talked policy and someone who had done it, between someone who scoffed at the system and someone who worked through it, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. A national radio host summed it up perfectly on his afternoon segment. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to clap back. America's doing it for her. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Republican aides began whispering the words no party wants to hear during midterms. She's toxic now. In private meetings, chairs quietly removed Karoline's name from upcoming policy panels. Talk radio, once her safe ground, now featured call-in after call-in from disillusioned listeners. One man's voice cracked as he said, "I voted for her. I believed her. Now I feel like a punchline." It was more than a bad week. It was a collapse, and everyone could see it happening in real time. And still Jasmine remained silent. No fanfare, no gloating. Just the same calm presence that had disarmed Karoline in the studio, that had written policy through the night, that had sent a 71-page bomb into Washington while the rest of the country was still asleep. Because while Karoline mocked the people behind the policies, Jasmine had already done the work, and the work was now speaking louder than either of them ever could. As Karoline's words scorched through the headlines, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She raised her sleeves. There was no press advisory, no motorcade, no podium with her name printed on a foam coreboard. At 8:42 a.m. the following morning, while cable news anchors still dissected Karoline Leavitt's implosion on a loop, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood outside a temporary shelter on the west end of Bridgeport, Connecticut, wearing a windbreaker, flats, and a name badge that simply read, "Visitor." The air smelled like wet concrete and something metallic. The parking lot was nearly empty. A rusted HVAC unit clicked steadily overhead. She didn't come with handlers or cameras. There was no media rollout. She'd promised to return here weeks ago, long before debates or headlines or hashtags, and today she kept that promise. Inside the shelter, rows of folding chairs lined the cafeteria. A wall-mounted whiteboard listed dinner hours and curfew rules. A little boy with matted hair sat coloring beside a woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her eyes puffy from lack of sleep, but focused like steel on the intake forms in front of her. That was the real backdrop, not cable news. Jasmine moved quietly, nodding to volunteers, accepting a clipboard from the facility director, and slipping into the flow of their operations. She reviewed case files, noted gaps in funding reports, and walked the halls, pausing at every room that had a door left open. One room had 4 bunk beds and 6 residents. Another had a sign taped to the wall. "Please let staff know if heat stops again." Jasmine read every detail. She asked about meal delivery lags. She asked why 2 applications for state vouchers had been marked return to sender. She didn't record. She didn't take notes for Twitter. She simply listened. The press eventually caught wind, of course. They always do. By mid-morning, a local stringer from the Hartford Times caught sight of her outside by the dumpsters, speaking softly with a maintenance worker about broken lighting along the East Corridor. By noon, a half-dozen reporters had formed a loose knot near the main entrance, murmuring into phones, adjusting camera angles, waiting for a moment, any moment they could frame. Jasmine didn't give them one. When a microphone was finally pushed her way and someone asked, "Congresswoman Crockett, do you have any comment on the Leavitt recording?" She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't blink. She just looked at the man behind the mic, young, nervous, hoping for a viral soundbite, and said in a tone calm enough to silence wind, "I'm not here to comment. I'm here to rebuild the system she made a joke of." She didn't wait for a follow-up. She turned and walked back inside. Behind her, a silence fell like a curtain. No shouting, no pushback, just a camera that didn't know whether to keep rolling or stop. Inside, the work resumed. She sat with a grandmother named Eloise who had been waiting 7 months for a decision on her housing voucher while sleeping in her daughter's SUV. Jasmine held her hand, not as a politician, but as a woman who understood what silence from a system feels like. She spoke with Jamal, a Navy veteran who'd been promised transitional housing that never came. He showed her a manila folder of paperwork that no one had touched. "I just want someone to read it," he said. Jasmine did. Right there, on the spot. No statements, no posture, just presence. At one point, a staffer offered to clear the room for privacy. Jasmine shook her head. "No need," she said. "This is where policy is supposed to start. from inside rooms like this. Outside, the temperature dropped. A reporter tried to stage a wider shot for the evening news, but Jasmine wouldn't stop moving, wouldn't pause for a headline. She was 5 steps ahead, already asking the shelter manager if the second boiler unit had been inspected this month, already calculating in her head how HUD's emergency allotment had failed to cover staff salaries in winter. Because while Karoline was bleeding donors and scrambling to unsay what had already been burned into public memory, Jasmine Crockett was standing inside the very system Karoline had mocked, touching it, questioning it, and doing the work no one ever saw on C-SPAN. The injustice wasn't just that Karoline had insulted people like Eloise and Jamal. It was that she assumed they'd never fight back. But they didn't have to. Jasmine was already fighting with them, and for them. By 2 p.m., a photo leaked online, not from her team, not from press, from a caseworker at the shelter. It showed Jasmine sitting on the floor with a child in a coloring book, cross-legged beside a radiator, her congressional pin barely visible against her collar. The caption was just 3 words. She showed up. That image went further than any rebuttal ever could. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't curated, it wasn't perfect. But it was real. And in a week where spin had consumed every inch of air, reality felt like revolution. Later that evening, as Jasmine left through the back entrance to avoid the remaining press, a volunteer called after her, voice trembling, "You're the first official who didn't just shake hands and leave." Jasmine turned, adjusted her coat, and replied quietly, "Because I don't believe in leaving before the story ends." And then she walked into the cold, the noise behind her forgotten, the work ahead waiting. As the noise outside grew louder inside the walls of the house, something rare was about to happen. Not a scandal, not a soundbite, but real movement. At exactly 10:03 a.m., the chamber air felt heavier than usual, like the ceiling itself was leaning in to listen. Room 216 of the Rayburn House office building, lined with dull oak panels and the faded smell of stale coffee, had rarely carried this much pressure. The Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development was convening for what should have been another procedural vote. Bills debated, amendments rejected, time wasted. But this wasn't procedural anymore, because the last item on the agenda was Jasmine Crockett's bill. The same one that started as a silent rebuttal, the same one that tore through political circles like a fault line. And now, with reporters crammed in the gallery, staffers standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and every seat filled by someone who had suddenly remembered why committee meetings still mattered. It was time to decide. Jasmine sat near the end of the semicircle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the document in question lying unopened before her. She hadn't spoken yet. Her eyes didn't dart, her posture didn't shift. She was still, like the quiet before a verdict. The chair cleared his throat. "We'll now move to vote on Resolution H.R. 4289, the Crockett Housing Reform Act." No fanfare, no prelude. The clerk began the roll call. Representative Delgado? Aye. Representative Kim? Nay. Representative Vasquez? Aye. Representative Bishop? Nay. The rhythm was cold, mechanical, like the slow turning of a safe dial. Every aye clicked louder than it should. Every nay lingered just long enough to inject doubt. And then came the name that turned heads before it was even spoken. Representative Rourke, a Republican from rural Colorado, veteran, conservative hardliner, never once crossed the aisle on housing. Everyone knew that, including him. He shifted, cleared his throat, and then, aye. The room didn't gasp, but it tightened. A subtle stretch of silence. Someone's pen scratched too loud. A staffer looked up like she'd misheard. Then came Representative Hall, an independent from Vermont, voted like a skeptic, spoke like a ghost. No one ever counted on him because he never committed to being counted. Aye. Now the silence was thunder. No celebration, just the room collectively realizing something had just cracked in the wall. The final count, 8 in favor, 5 against. Jasmine's bill had passed committee. No applause followed, just a long, reverent pause. Because for once, in a room built to delay and dilute, A piece of legislation had not only survived, but moved forward. The chair cleared his throat again, this time with the faintest tinge of surprise. House Resolution 4289 will be forwarded to the House floor for consideration. And that was it, a single sentence. But in that room, it felt like history whispering itself into the record. Jasmine stood, slow and measured, smoothing the crease in her blazer. All cameras turned. Microphones floated toward her like moths to quiet flame. She didn't blink. "I didn't write this for airtime," she said, voice low but unmistakable, like concrete underfoot. "I didn't write it for applause or retweets or panels on prime time. I wrote it for people who stopped asking for help years ago because the silence they got back taught them not to try again." A breath passed. A reporter's pen stopped moving. "I did this for the people who've been left behind so often, they don't even bother raising their hands anymore." Another pause. "This bill is for them." Then she walked out. No grin, no victory lap, no raised fists. Just steps that didn't need to be loud to carry weight. In the hallway, her aide Liana was already waiting, eyes wide with the quiet awe of someone watching history refuse to be announced. Only proven. She didn't speak, just nodded once. Jasmine smiled. Not for a camera, not for the press, but for herself. Not because it was over, because it had finally begun. As Jasmine's proposal crossed aisles and won quiet applause in rooms that once ignored her, Karoline found herself drowning in the noise she created. Only now, no one was listening. It began with a silence she didn't expect. Not from the media. They were louder than ever. Not from Jasmine. Her silence was strategic. It came from within. From the people who used to orbit Karoline Leavitt like satellites. Staffers, consultants, donors, interns, all suddenly unreachable. The inbox that once rang with calendar holds and media requests now returned more automated replies than confirmations. Meetings postponed, calls missed, aides out sick. Inside her Capitol Hill office, the lights stayed on, but the energy was gone. Her senior communications director walked out just before 9 a.m., his passkey left on the edge of her desk. No warning, just 2 words scribbled on a post-it. "Can't spin this." By midday, it felt like a campaign funeral. Her scheduler, a Marine veteran who had followed her since the governor's race, handed in a resignation letter that was just 1 paragraph long. "I came here to serve policy, not recover from PR disasters." The campaign finance director didn't even call. She simply emailed a list of donors who had reconsidered, each one redlined with a single phrase: funding withdrawn. A PAC from Florida, a real estate group from Ohio. The largest one, a Silicon Valley funder who once hosted private dinners in Karoline's honor, returned her donation request with 2 words in the memo: hard pass. That night, desperate to show she was still in control, Karoline walked onto a live set at Capitol Focus tonight. Her heels clicked confidently, her jaw clenched beneath the perfect makeup job. She smiled on cue, sat straight. The lights flared, cameras blinked red, and the anchor didn't waste time. "Congresswoman Leavitt, the recording that surfaced last week has drawn backlash not only from Democrats but also key figures in your own party. Do you stand by what you said?" She blinked, steady but cornered. "I think people misunderstood the context. I was referring to the way messaging gets lost in politics, not the people themselves." Her voice was even. Her hands didn't shake, but her eyes kept drifting. To the floor manager, the teleprompter, the live timer inching forward like a noose. The anchor pressed on. But the line about people not reading laws and celebrating slogans over substance, was that not a direct attack on the very voters you claim to represent? Karoline forced a chuckle, the kind that sounds like a lie you rehearsed but didn't quite believe. "We all speak differently behind closed doors. But I want to make one thing clear. I believe in respectful dialogue. I want to move forward together." The segment ended, but nothing moved forward. After the broadcast, there were no calls of support, no follow-up interviews, only silence, thick and heavy, like fog in a locked room. Her phone vibrated once, a single message from her former strategist. You should lay low. You're radioactive. The next morning, Politico ran the headline, blunt as a hammer. Leavitt's base cracks, the collapse of a conservative darling. Inside was a brutal quote from an anonymous GOP donor. She wanted a war of words. Jasmine gave her a war of records. Now she's out of ammunition. The comment hit harder than any meme. Across social media, Karoline's posts were met not with fury, but with emptiness. Comments trickled in, not from trolls, but from longtime supporters now saying things like, "I'm disappointed," or worse, "I'm done." By noon, her media booker canceled every planned appearance for the week. No upside, the memo read. Even the right-wing talk shows, once her loudest cheerleaders, had pivoted to new controversies. She wasn't even being mocked anymore. She was being erased. In desperation, she tried one final broadcast. A solo address streamed from her office with an American flag propped behind her like a shield. She sat stiffly in a navy suit, her voice tight but practiced. "I want the country to know that my words were taken out of context. I've always fought for working families, always believed in dialogue, and I will continue to show up, even when it's hard." But the words felt like an echo inside a vacuum. The live viewer count never broke 10,000, a fraction of her former base. Comments flashed on the side of the screen, most of them one word: nope. Too late. Explain voting against it first. What cut deepest wasn't the criticism, it was the disinterest. She'd lit the match herself, and now the smoke was choking her out. Back in her office, Karoline sat alone in the dimming light. Outside her window, DC moved on. Reporters packed up. Emails went unanswered. Her staffers, once eager young idealists, now disappeared one by one. Not in protest, but in quiet retreat. She was losing not in a blaze of scandal, but in a slow, clinical rejection. The kind that doesn't scream, it just leaves. And when she looked in the mirror that evening, she didn't see a fighter. She saw a figure reciting apologies into a void. Her voice hadn't changed, but the country had turned the volume all the way down. While Karoline's voice faded into empty statements and unanswered calls, Jasmine Crockett stood at the edge of a moment that wasn't about power, it was about redemption. It was just past 2 p.m. when the double doors to the House chamber swung open and Jasmine Crockett stepped inside. Her heels echoed against the marble, steady and deliberate, like someone not walking into a fight, but finishing one. Every seat was filled. The press gallery overflowed. The floor buzzed with whispered strategy, restless eyes, silent calculations. But Jasmine, she was silent, still, focused. In the sea of lawmakers, fidgeting with ties, checking notes, and glancing at aides, she stood with her hands at her sides. No phone, no folder, just a small pin over her heart, shaped like a broken house stitched back together. The clerk read the title of the bill aloud. House Resolution 4289, the Crockett Housing Reform Act. No longer a draft, no longer a PDF passed in the early dawn hours. It was now legislation, alive, debated, and standing at the edge of law. The speaker gave the floor to the bill's sponsor, and Jasmine Crockett took a breath, not to calm herself, but to center something deeper. "I stand here not for applause," she began, her voice not raised but unmistakably present. "I stand here because somewhere in this country, right now, a 7-year-old girl is doing homework in the backseat of a car, and she doesn't know who I am. She doesn't care what party I represent. She just knows it's cold, and she wants to sleep without hearing her mom cry again." The chamber didn't move. Some lowered their eyes. Others leaned in. "We're not here today to congratulate each other," she continued. "We're here to do something long overdue. We are not repaying favors. We are repaying a moral debt." A few murmurs rippled, but no one interrupted. She turned, slowly scanning the room. To the veterans we shoved into temporary housing with broken heat, to the grandmothers raising 3 grandkids in motel rooms because no landlord will take their voucher, to the families redlined out of mortgages, then blamed for not owning homes, they were always here. We just chose not to see them. Silence wrapped around the chamber like a steel band. No more edits, no more excuses. This bill is not perfect, but neither is justice when it arrives late. Today we don't owe each other thanks. We owe America's invisible a promise. We see you now. And with that, she stepped back. No grand close, no rallying cry, just a heartbeat's worth of silence before the vote began. The chamber lit up in green and red as members cast their votes, some quickly, some with hesitation, some stood still, staring at the screen like it might blink twice and disappear. The numbers rolled upward: 78, 102, 141. Jasmine didn't watch. She kept her hands folded. Every second passed like a drop of mercury sliding down glass. Inevitable, weighty, irreversible. At 2:36 p.m., the count froze. 229 oui, 204 nay oui. The bill had passed. The sound in the chamber wasn't explosive. It was subdued. Reverent. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you realize the damage is not just behind you, but finally acknowledged. Aides clapped silently. Reporters bolted from the gallery. Staffers wiped away tears they hadn't meant to show. One congressman whispered to a colleague, "I didn't think it would make it this far." But it had. And Jasmine Crockett had walked it there without screaming once. Outside the chamber, cameras swarmed. Questions flew. One reporter, young, breathless, shoved her mic forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you feel like you finally had the last word in this debate?" Jasmine stopped, not because she didn't expect it, but because she knew it was coming. Her eyes met the reporters. No smirk, no shade, just clarity. "I was never here for the last word," she said. "I was here for better words." She turned, walked down the marble steps, and vanished into the crowd, not needing the spotlight to know she'd already changed the direction it pointed. The halls of Congress still echoed with the soundless weight of what had just happened. The Crockett Housing Reform Act hadn't just passed. It had landed like a meteor in the heart of American politics, shifting the ground under every carefully built narrative. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to watch the aftershocks. While pundits were still catching their breath and opponents were scrambling for spin, Jasmine was already gone. No press conference, no victory lap, no smug tweet. Instead, she slipped out a side door and walked 3 blocks in the cold, wind tugging at the hem of her coat, toward a forgotten part of D.C., where cable news never bothered to point a camera. She arrived at a low brick building with flickering lights and a buzzer that hadn't worked since the Obama years. A free clinic and housing resource center. The carpet inside was threadbare, the waiting chairs mismatched and scuffed. But the staff stood the moment she walked in, not out of formality, out of disbelief. No member of Congress had ever come through their doors without a press team and a photo op. Jasmine nodded politely, took off her coat, and rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what you're still fighting," she said. There were 12 of them: caseworkers, social workers, 2 shelter directors, a nurse practitioner, and one exhausted woman who ran housing placement for 3 wards with nothing but a phone and a yellowing Excel sheet. They hadn't prepped a slideshow. They weren't ready for questions. But Jasmine didn't ask for that. She asked for their binders, their pain points, their stalled grants, and their broken intake systems. She asked about the families whose names never made the policy memos. She sat at a folding table, no notepad, just listening, leaning in. One caseworker, Jamal, rubbed his temples as he spoke. "We've got 12 kids under 10 living in a shelter that wasn't built for families. No playroom, no quiet space. They cry every night because the men down the hall scream in their sleep." Jasmine didn't flinch. "How long have they been there?" 3 months, some longer. 2 got held back from school because they moved 3 times in a semester." She looked him in the eye. "Put their names on the back of my print copy." Another, Mariella, slid a packet across the table. "These are the forms we use to verify housing need. They haven't been updated in 9 years. The state won't honor digital signatures, so we're printing these out, mailing them to be signed, then scanning them back. It takes weeks. Families get evicted while waiting." Jasmine flipped through the pages, her fingers grazing the handwritten annotations in the margins. She looked up. "This is what they call red tape. I call it a noose." Someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The meeting stretched to 90 minutes, then 2 hours. No cameras, no interns bringing coffee, just the rustle of paper, the creak of metal chairs, and the low burn of urgency. Jasmine didn't glance at her watch once. She only asked 2 things. What has no one fixed? And what did you give up trying to fight for? At the end, she stood, gathering the documents they'd handed her. She didn't make promises, didn't toss out hopeful headlines. She simply said, "I'll be back, not to listen, to report." Outside, the street was darker than when she arrived. Fog crept up from the sewer grates. Somewhere in the distance, a siren moaned. But Jasmine didn't rush. She walked slow, like someone carrying more than just paperwork. Like someone who knew the story didn't end with a vote. Because real victory isn't written in ink. It's earned in the places no one films. And that's exactly where she was going next. The sun had already dropped below the rooftops of Gary, Indiana, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Inside apartment 2B of a weathered brick complex that hadn't seen a new coat of paint in over a decade, Thomas Rivers sat in a wooden chair so worn it leaned slightly to the left. The kitchen smelled like boiled coffee and old books. On the small linoleum table lay a folded copy of the Post-Tribune, a chipped coffee mug, and a dusty radio that hadn't worked since 2016. The only light came from the TV screen across the room, casting its cold blue glow across his deep-lined face. Thomas was 73 years old, a Vietnam combat medic, Bronze Star, dishonorably discharged, then honorably restored because they had finally admitted their mistake. 3 grown children, 5 grandkids. 2 of them didn't speak to him anymore. 1 did sometimes. A 4th eviction notice now yellowed and pinned to the fridge with a rusted Veterans of Foreign Wars magnet. He hadn't taken it down, not because he wanted to remember, but because there was no point. But tonight something was different. He reached for the remote with a stiff hand, bones clicking, and raised the volume. C-SPAN was rebroadcasting the final vote from earlier that day. He watched as names lit up in green and red. Yay, nay. The numbers rolled slowly upward, an arithmetic of the powerful, as distant as the moon. But Thomas knew what those votes meant, not from think tanks or op-eds, but from cold nights with no heat, from waiting 5 hours at the VA for a medication that never came, from seeing his neighbor, Miss Lila, freeze to death in her wheelchair 2 winters ago because her Section 8 renewal got lost in the shuffle. And then she appeared, Jasmine Crockett, not shouting, not grandstanding, just standing. Her eyes didn't dart, her voice didn't tremble. She looked like someone who had already walked through the fire and didn't need to remind anyone of the burn. "Today we don't say thank you to each other," she said on screen. "We say I see you to the people we failed to see." Thomas blinked, slow. His hands, rough from years of welding and fixing everything but his own broken luck, trembled a little. That woman, he didn't know her, never met her, didn't vote for her, but she had said something months ago on a live stream that stuck with him. "I don't write bills for cameras. I write them for people who can't afford to wait anymore." He remembered scribbling his name down in shaky pen on one of those petition sheets some volunteer kid had brought to the VA. "If you've been denied housing due to paperwork delay, tell your story." He hadn't told it all, just enough. He didn't think anyone was reading, but somehow she had. He rose slowly, knee joints protesting, and shuffled over to the fridge. The eviction notice stared back at him like it always had, words printed in bold, indifferent ink. Final notification. Relocation required within 10 days. The manager had said it wasn't personal. Just business. Market's moving up. You understand. He had nodded then, but now he was tired of understanding. He pulled the notice down, grabbed a match from the drawer and struck it against the side of the counter. The flame took hold slowly, licking the corner of the page. He held it over the sink, watched it curl, blacken, turn to ash. There was no celebration, no music, just that quiet crackle of paper burning, and the weight of something lifting off his shoulders. As he watched it burn, he muttered, not in anger, not in pride, but in recognition. Damn right. They see us now. He stayed there for a long moment, watching the ashes settle in the stainless steel basin. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the kitchen table. The chair groaned under him as he sat. He picked up the remote, this time not to mute the noise, but to listen. Crockett was still on screen. She wasn't speaking anymore, just sitting, silent, watching the vote numbers lock into place. Her fingers tapped once on the desk in front of her, A small, unconscious rhythm, like she was counting something older than politics. Thomas recognized it. That's how soldiers look when they're watching a field, waiting for the wind to shift. He exhaled. It had been years, decades, since he believed in a vote. But this one felt different. Not because it fixed everything. It didn't. Not yet. But because for once, someone in power hadn't just seen the charts. They saw him. And now for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he had the right to stay in the room. Not as a statistic, but as a citizen. He looked around the kitchen, the cracked ceiling, the leaning cabinet, the list of medications scotch-taped to the wall. Then he smiled just a little. Not because it was over, but because maybe, just maybe, it had finally started. The studio lights were too hot, but Karoline didn't ask for them to be dimmed. That would have made her look rattled. She sat straight in the high-back leather chair, knees crossed, a folder balanced perfectly across her lap like a shield. Her blazer was the color of resolve, deep crimson, but her knuckles, clutched around the folder's edge, were pale white. Behind her, the LED screen read, "The Crockett bill, too fast, too far." It was supposed to be a safe segment, an interview on a conservative-leaning network. The producer had promised, no ambushes, we'll keep it focused on policy, not the drama. But Karoline had learned the hard way. Nothing was safe when the tides were shifting. And lately, they weren't just shifting. They were rising. The host, polished and practiced, greeted her with a toothy smile. "Congresswoman Leavitt, thank you for joining us." She nodded. "Glad to be here." Her voice was steady, but thinner than usual. They exchanged pleasantries, jobs reports, inflation, border security. Then the host leaned in slightly, index finger tapping his cue card like it was a countdown. "Let's talk housing," he said. "Your name's been tied, rightly or wrongly, to Congresswoman Crockett's proposal. There's a lot of noise out there. Give us your side." Karoline didn't blink. She had practiced this answer 15 times. "I've always believed in practical solutions," she began. "Not slogans, not emotional appeals. Housing is a serious issue. It deserves more than a headline." The host raised a brow. "Are you suggesting her bill is just headlines?" Karoline hesitated, but just for half a second. "I'm suggesting it's reactive. It's not how we do responsible governance." "But the data checks out," he said, more quickly than she expected. "Reuters confirmed the numbers. Even some of your Republican colleagues have expressed quiet support. Isn't this a moment to recalibrate?" There it was. The trap wasn't in the question. It was in the tone. Karoline forced a laugh. "It's easy to write something that sounds good. That plays well on social media. But policy is about sustainability, not just empathy." The host's smile flickered. She passed the bill. Empathy or not, it's policy now. A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face. She masked it with a breath. "She played the game well," she said, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll give her that." The host didn't respond. Instead, the screen behind them shifted to B-roll of Jasmine touring a shelter in Rhode Island. No cameras, no press, just grainy footage caught on someone's phone. Volunteers, folded chairs, Jasmine in sneakers, holding a clipboard. The silence between Karoline's last words and the image was deafening. And then came the real blow. The host leaned in again. "There's also been some chatter about a leaked audio clip. A fundraiser in Charleston. Your voice allegedly saying," he checked the quote card, "these people don't care about substance. Give them a slogan, and they're happy." Karoline's eyes narrowed. That was taken out of context. "Then what's the context?" She blinked. "It was a joke. Off the record. Everyone in the room knew that." "Did you deny saying it?" Silence. A beat passed. Karoline inhaled sharply. "Look, I'm here because I want a productive conversation. I'm tired of the media trying to make this about personalities. I've said repeatedly that I welcome real dialogue." "But no one's answering your call," the host said, his voice softening. "Not in sympathy, but in precision. Your statement last night got almost no coverage. Donors are stepping back. Allies are quiet. Do you feel isolated in this moment?" Her lips tightened. She didn't answer that. Not directly. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice lower, tighter. I think the public deserves honesty, and I think we've mistaken charisma for competence. The host nodded slowly. Do you believe Congresswoman Crockett lacks competence? Another beat, and this time Karoline saw it. The invisible line, the point of no return. She pulled back. I believe we disagree on methods. Too late. The screen behind them was already replaying the audio leak. These people don't even read the policies. Give them a slogan and a punchline, pretending they understand Crockett's 10-point housing reform. Karoline flinched, but only slightly. The host didn't press further. He didn't need to. The clip had done the work. The interview wound down with rehearsed talking points. Job creation, economic strength, traditional values. But even as she spoke them, Karoline could feel the air had left the room. The studio was still lit, the microphone still live, but the conversation had moved on. Somewhere else. To someone else. The segment ended. The lights dimmed. Staffers moved quickly to reset for the next guest. Karoline stood, smoothing her skirt, but no one offered eye contact. No one rushed to her side. Her communications director had already left during the second break. In the hallway, her phone buzzed. 3 texts, one from a donor. Let's circle back next quarter. One from a former strategist. You should probably sit things out for a while. And the last from her press aide, now formally resigned. They're not listening anymore. I suggest you do the same. Karoline stood alone outside the green room, heels clicking against tile as she walked slowly to the exit. Behind her, the TV replayed Jasmine's closing line from the house floor. I wasn't here for the last word. I was here for better ones. For the first time, Karoline realized maybe she had said all the wrong ones. And as Jasmine sat there in the quiet hum of her office, the letter folded beside her, something in the silence shifted. Not just around her, but inside her. Because this wasn't just about one bill, one vote, or one veteran. It was about every room where power had spoken too loudly and listened too little. It was about every dismissed voice, every brushed aside complaint, every "we'll get back to you" that never came. And in that stillness, the truth pulsed louder than any floor vote. What Jasmine had done was not just legislative. It was deeply, irreversibly human. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. When systems forget people, people stop believing in systems. For too long, government had become a language only insiders understood. Sterile, coded, self-congratulating. But Jasmine had chosen a different vocabulary. She had written in the voices of the evicted, the uninsured, the underpaid. She had spoken plainly where others spun. And in doing so, she reminded the nation that dignity isn't restored by charisma or clapping. It's restored by listening when no one else will. Jasmine faced mockery, minimization, even contempt. Not for being wrong, but for daring to care out loud in a room built to reward distance. Karoline had tried to reduce her into a soundbite. Twitter tried to bury her under noise. But truth, when backed by lived reality, doesn't need to shout. It just stands, unshaken. Jasmine had done what the loudest critics could not. She had outlasted them by outworking them. She didn't trade fire for fire. She turned every insult into fuel and let the work burn on its own. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all was this: the people who need the most are the ones least likely to ask. Not because they're weak, but because they're tired. Tired of being ignored, blamed, or told that survival is somehow a failure of effort. Jasmine's quiet revolution wasn't just in passing a bill. It was in showing the country what leadership without ego looks like. It was in reminding every Thomas Rivers across America that they were never the problem. Just the proof that the system hadn't been fixed. So when future leaders ask what made this moment matter, let them look not at the applause, the ratings, or even the vote tally. Let them look at the silence that followed. The kind of silence that only arrives when something deeply true has been spoken. That is where the real power lives. Not in who gets the last word, but in who speaks the one that finally lands. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. It took just seconds of silence on national TV for Jasmine Crockett to expose what 5 years of polished branding tried to hide. Live from a Women in Power panel, she dropped one line, calm, precise, that left millions breathless and forced Melania Trump's name into every headline without ever saying it. Crockett didn't attack. She held up a mirror, and the reflection shook the nation. What began as a question about leadership became a viral reckoning with silence, privilege, and the cost of being a first lady who vanishes when it matters most. But when the truth hits that hard, who gets to walk away untouched? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the unforgiving glare of the studio lights, the stage gleamed like a polished courtroom, clinical, composed, and built for control. 5 women sat in a curved line of ivory chairs, each perfectly lit, each perfectly briefed. Cameras from CSPAN moved like predators on rails, capturing every blink, every breath. The topic was women in power, but the energy was flat, ceremonial, until one voice shattered the calm. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't speak first, but when she did, it was as if someone had cracked open the floor beneath them. The moderator had just asked, "Do spouses of public officials have a duty to live the values they represent?" A pause. Then Jasmine leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands folded, her voice low but loaded. "You can't cherry-pick the job," she said. "You can't choose the flowers and skip the funeral. You don't get to embrace the pretty parts of a title and vanish when it gets ugly." Her words sliced through the polite air like broken glass. A flicker ran through the crowd. Nervous movement, shifting feet, someone coughing too loudly in the back. Jasmine wasn't done. Her gaze was razor sharp, locked not on the panel, but the lens, straight through to America's living rooms. "We praise visibility," she said, "but where was it when children were screaming in cages? Where was it when mothers were begging not to be separated from their babies? Nowhere. Not a word. Just silence and a green jacket that mocked every pain it passed." The temperature dropped. A production assistant off stage muttered something into a headset. Panic rising. The screen glitched once, then the feed went black. For 8 full seconds, nothing. No sound, no image. Just a still shot of the C-SPAN logo hanging in dead air. Emergency delay protocols had been triggered, not because of profanity, not because of scandal, but because truth had been spoken too clearly, too forcefully, too dangerously. When the picture returned, the silence in the studio wasn't technical, it was human. No applause, no rebuttals, just frozen faces. Jasmine sat still, unmoved, unblinking. She hadn't said a name, but everyone knew. The way she framed it, the timing, the iconic green jacket reference. It wasn't just commentary, it was a controlled demolition. She had aimed directly at Melania Trump without ever pulling the trigger. And yet the impact had landed like a missile. And while Jasmine's words rippled through the country like a thunderclap, raw, surgical, impossible to ignore, far from the cameras behind gilded walls and drawn curtains, Melania Trump watched in silence. But this silence was not strength. It was pressure building in a sealed room. It was a woman being called out without warning and realizing the world was watching for her reaction. The East Parlor of Mar-a-Lago felt colder than usual, not from the air conditioning, but from the tension that had settled like a fog in the corners of the room. Melania Trump sat perfectly still on a cream velvet chaise, legs crossed, back straight, every inch of her posture designed for control. And yet, there was no peace in her eyes. The television in front of her had no sound, but she didn't need it. The image was burned in. Jasmine Crockett, eyes fierce and calm, speaking without raising her voice, speaking directly through the screen. Her words had been clipped and shared 1,000 times already, looped on cable news, spliced across TikTok, reposted with captions like, "She said what we've all been thinking." But here in this room built on luxury and secrecy, it played out differently. Jasmine hadn't shouted, she hadn't cursed, She hadn't even said Melania's name, but she may as well have. Melania's phone buzzed again on the glass table beside her. She didn't look. Notifications had been flooding in for the past 2 hours. Texts from acquaintances, missed calls from conservative anchors, a direct message from her cousin in Slovenia that simply read, "What did you do?" Her reflection caught in the glass surface of the table. Perfect makeup, perfectly still, but beneath it, something cracked. The unfairness of it stung, sharp and personal. She hadn't asked for this fight. She hadn't even spoken. And yet now she was being judged for silence, as if silence was a crime. Across from her, Helena Zavros stood holding a printed transcript, the pages slightly bent from her grip. She didn't sit. She didn't speak at first. She knew the room too well, but after a moment, her voice slipped in like a careful whisper. "We should release something. Even just a sentence. Set the tone. Remind people who you are." Melania didn't turn her head. Her voice came low and flat. "I am who I am. I don't need to explain it every time someone throws a stone." Helena moved closer. "This isn't a stone. This is different." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was practical, the way someone points out a gas leak. Not to panic, but to save the house. "People are watching. They think you're hiding." Melania finally looked up, her voice tight. "Let them. I don't play their game." She stood abruptly, walked toward the tall window draped in ivory silk, and pushed the curtain aside just enough to see the sky. It was blue, cloudless, mocking. "Every time I speak, they twist it. When I stay quiet, they say I don't care. So which is it? Am I fake when I smile, or cruel when I say nothing?" Her voice didn't rise, but it trembled, just slightly beneath the surface. "No matter what I do, they want me wrong." Helena lowered the papers and sat gently on the edge of a chair. "Maybe it's not about being right anymore. Maybe it's about being seen." Melania let out a breath. Slow, tired. She turned away from the window and folded her arms, almost like she was hugging herself. "I never wanted the spotlight," she said softly. "I wanted to protect my son. I wanted a quiet life, but he made noise for all of us. And now they expect me to answer for it." Her words hung in the air, heavy, real. Then she looked Helena dead in the eyes. "No, I won't respond. I don't need to fight someone I've never met just to prove I have a heart." But outside that room, her team wasn't so calm. In the west wing of the estate, aides were gathering quietly inside offices, whispering urgently in hallways. One staffer had already drafted 3 different responses, none of which had been approved. Another was on the phone with a media consultant who said plainly, if she doesn't say something by tonight, she'll lose control of the narrative. Her public silence, once seen as poise, was now starting to look like avoidance. Headlines had shifted in tone. Crockett speaks. Will Melania? In private text chains, donors were nervous. Conservative influencers were divided. Some begged for a response. Others warned it was a trap. And in the center of it all, Melania Trump stood completely still, a woman who had mastered survival through elegance and restraint, but who now found herself branded by the very thing that had once protected her. Silence. And for the first time in years, she felt it, not as armor, but as a weight pressing down from all sides. Not because she was wrong, not because she was cruel, but because in the game of perception, the only unforgivable sin is not playing at all. While Melania stood behind marble walls trying to hold on to her silence, the outside world was already erupting. Not in whispers, but in firestorms. Tweet by tweet, clip by clip, echoing across a nation that had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say the thing they all felt but never dared to voice. It started as a flicker, a single 22-second clip posted by a college sophomore in Atlanta, captioned, "She didn't lie, she didn't even flinch." Within minutes, it had crossed platforms, shared to TikTok, clipped again for X, then uploaded in full to YouTube by a political streamer who called it the most brutally honest takedown of First Lady culture we've ever seen. The algorithm didn't just bite, it swallowed. Hashtags began to pulse like warning lights. Be Best But Silent took off first, followed closely by Crockett in Silence, Choose Speak Like Jasmine, and the sharp, mocking Decorate But Don't Defend. Across phones and laptops, in cafes, classrooms, subways and kitchens. Millions of people stared at Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence, lips pressed in firm resolve, saying the thing they'd been screaming in private for years. She didn't shout, she didn't blink, and in doing so, she made the world listen. By noon, the clip had been translated into 6 languages by fan accounts from Brazil to Berlin. TikTok creators layered the audio over footage of protests, immigrant children crying at detention centers, even slow-motion shots of Melania stepping off Air Force One in the infamous green jacket. On Reddit, a post titled, This is what leadership looks like. Climb to the top of r/politics in under an hour. On Instagram, influencers who usually posted about skincare and matcha were suddenly quoting Jasmine word for word. You can't pick the flowers and ignore the roots. You can't claim kindness and choose silence. People weren't just sharing it, they were absorbing it. A cultural nerve had been hit. Hard. Somewhere in Austin, a high school history teacher paused her lesson and projected the clip for her students. In New York, a group of organizers paused a local shelter meeting to replay the speech and talk about it. A veteran in Kansas City posted a selfie with the caption, "I didn't vote for her. I'd fight for her." This wasn't just virality, it was a collective exhale. A generation of people, women especially, who had been told to be polite, to be composed, to stay in their lane, were now watching one of their own tear the lane wide open. Jasmine hadn't attacked with emotion. She had sliced with truth. And the silence that followed wasn't fear. It was recognition. Finally, people said. Finally, someone said it. The reaction wasn't limited to the left. Conservative women who had long felt uncomfortable but boxed in by loyalty were quietly sharing the clip in private groups. This isn't about politics, one wrote. It's about the difference between showing up and checking out. Former Republican staffers began liking Jasmine's words from anonymous burner accounts. Journalists whispered to each other that this moment felt different, that it wasn't just a headline, but a hinge, a pivot point. One anchor on a morning news show even broke script, saying softly, "Whatever you think of the Congresswoman, she told the truth, and the truth doesn't flinch." The control room went quiet, but the most powerful impact came from people who had never followed politics. A factory worker in Indiana stitched Jasmine's quote into a custom jacket for his daughter. A single mom in Arizona recorded a reaction video through tears saying, "I was one of those moms Jasmine talked about. I stayed quiet at my old job when they called us just cleaning ladies." Never again. Across the country, people weren't just reposting, they were remembering. Remembering every moment they'd bitten their tongues to survive, every room they'd shrunk in to stay safe. And now, watching Jasmine Crockett on a 1080p screen with fire in her eyes, they felt something ancient rise. Permission. Permission to question. Permission to call out the beautiful silence that had covered years of ugliness. Permission to say, that's not enough anymore. The clip hit 10 million views before sunset, and with every refresh, the number surged higher. 11.2 million, 12.6, 14.8. It wasn't a speech, it was a spark. And as the fire spread, something deeper began to unravel. The traditional mold of the First Lady, graceful, reserved, politically untouched, was being held up to the light and torn apart. Girls in debate clubs, moms in minivans, students in dorm rooms were asking out loud, why did we ever accept quiet as grace? Why did we ever confuse decoration with dignity? Why was silence ever considered noble? Jasmine hadn't named names, but she had cracked a myth, a decades-old American fantasy of the politically neutral wife who stands beside power but never challenges it, who is praised for restraint while the world burns behind her. In a single moment, Jasmine didn't just challenge Melania Trump. She challenged the very foundation of performative elegance. And people were done pretending not to notice. If silence was grace, they asked, then what was complicity? As dusk fell over the country, the clip played again, this time projected on a wall at a college protest in Chicago. A chant broke out after it ended, not angry, but rhythmic, like gospel in motion. You want the praise, take the pressure. You want the title, carry the weight. From Washington to Wichita, from TikTok teens to retired nurses, the message spread like wildfire wrapped in clarity. Jasmine Crockett had spoken once, and people weren't just listening. They were repeating her. While the world argued over Jasmine's words and Melania's silence, somewhere in a cramped office lined with dusty books and buzzing monitors, a young journalist quietly opened a file that no one was ever supposed to see. And in doing so, he didn't just uncover a document. He unearthed a truth that had been buried alive. Theo Padron was 28 years old, underpaid, undercredited, and utterly obsessed with the truth. He worked for a mid-sized investigative outlet out of Fort Lauderdale, tucked inside a fourth-floor walk-up that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. His desk was a mess. Legal pads, gum wrappers, a cracked monitor, and a handwritten quote pinned to the wall. Facts don't flinch. It wasn't glory he was chasing, it was clarity. And on that particular Thursday afternoon, clarity arrived disguised as boredom. He was following a thread for a completely unrelated story, something about ghost-written speeches from 2018, when he stumbled into an unindexed archive of internal First Lady communications. Most of it was fluff. Talking points for garden tours, drafts of remarks for school events, costume approvals for Christmas decor. He almost skipped the file labeled FLS_WHC_draft_V3_June_2018. It sounded like every other dead end, but habit made him open it anyway. The first few lines were diplomatic to a fault, standard lines about compassion, civility, our shared humanity. But then something shifted. The sentences turned bolder, more pointed. The policy of separating children from their parents at the border contradicts the fundamental values of this nation. It is cruel, and it must stop. Theo stopped scrolling. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. This wasn't a quote crafted by lawyers. It read like something personal, something felt. A paragraph later, the language intensified. As a mother, I cannot look away. This practice causes irreparable trauma. No political outcome justifies such suffering. Theo blinked. This wasn't just a private opinion. It was a full-throated objection to one of the most controversial policies of the Trump administration, written from inside the House. But what made his breath catch wasn't the paragraph itself. It was the handwritten note scribbled beneath it, added in thick black ink, almost angry in its pressure. 4 words, 4 devastating words. Do not send. He won't allow it. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. The note was raw and unfiltered, clearly added after the draft had been finalized. The contrast between the typed hope and the handwritten command was violent. Whoever wrote this hadn't just rejected the statement, they had silenced it, blocked it, killed it. Theo sat back slowly, staring at the screen like he'd just opened a time capsule full of gas and flame. Melania Trump, accused for years of indifference, aloofness, even cruelty, had tried at least once to speak up, and someone had stopped her. The document's metadata confirmed it had been created in late June 2018, right as public outrage over family separation was reaching its peak. Its last edit timestamp matched perfectly with a flurry of White House internal security emails Theo had cross-referenced from a previous FOIA request. Everything checked out. The formatting was authentic, the phrasing aligned with Melania's known speech drafts. And the handwriting, Theo had it examined against 4 separate calendar entries from her personal assistant's notes. Same flourishes, same loops, same subtle tilt in the E's and F's. There was no doubt. She wrote it. He paced the office for nearly 10 minutes, heart thudding. This wasn't just a good scoop. This was a powder keg, because it didn't just prove that Melania had felt discomfort. It proved she had actively opposed a brutal policy and been shut down. And not in public, in private, before the cameras, before the jacket, before the silence. She hadn't stayed quiet because she didn't care. She'd stayed quiet because someone made sure her voice never left the room. He called his editor. No preamble. Just read the note over the phone. On the other end, a long silence, then a single sentence. If this is real, it changes everything. Theo nodded, though no one could see him. It's real, he said. I've verified it 6 ways. His editor's voice was steady but urgent. Don't tweet it. Don't tease it. Write it clean. Write it careful. No drama. Just the truth. Theo didn't need to be told twice. He wasn't here to burn someone down. He was here to open a door the country didn't know was locked. And in the back of his mind, he kept hearing Jasmine Crockett's voice from that now famous clip. You don't get to disappear when kids are crying in cages. But maybe, just maybe, Melania had tried not to. Maybe she had fought behind the scenes, and the world never saw it because someone made sure we never would. Until now. Theo had already uncovered one buried truth, but something about the system's neatness felt wrong, too clean, too final. And in journalism, when a story ends too perfectly, it usually means there's another one still hidden underneath. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to find would be bigger, riskier, and far more explosive. The folder didn't even have a name, just a string of numbers and a single word: drafts. It was buried deep inside the directory of Archive First Lady Communications, attached to a long-forgotten internal memo about speech scheduling from the summer of 2020. The file wasn't supposed to be there. In fact, Theo only clicked on it out of habit, a final sweep, the kind you do when your gut says, check one more. The document opened slowly, lagging behind as if even the system didn't want it read. But when the text finally appeared, he stopped breathing. It wasn't the tone that stunned him. It was the first sentence. In times of deep pain, silence is not elegance. It is abandonment. Theo sat completely still. The room around him felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. The line didn't sound like politics. It sounded like someone had finally broken. Not the kind of speech built by consultants or filtered by 10 layers of PR. This was real, vulnerable, written, it seemed, by a woman who was done watching from behind the curtain. The speech was dated early June 2020, just days after George Floyd's murder had set the nation ablaze in grief and fury. The air back then had been thick with rage. Millions took to the streets. Cities were on fire. People were screaming not just for justice, but for acknowledgement. And here it was, buried inside a folder no one ever opened, a statement from Melania Trump that didn't dance around the pain. It named it. She had written about the need to listen to Black communities, not with defensiveness, but with humility. She acknowledged that being First Lady came with a platform, and that choosing silence during injustice was a betrayal of that platform. Theo's eyes scanned faster now. The next paragraph condemned the idea that order should come before dignity. She wrote plainly, "Peace is not the absence of protest. Peace is the presence of justice." She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't hedging. She was, at least in these words, trying to stand where the country needed her most. And then, the red ink. Not from her, from someone else. An internal communications director, based on the digital metadata. In the margins, too strong, too political, POTUS will object. And just beneath it, the worst word Theo had come to expect from these buried drafts. Delete. Not revise, not postpone, just delete. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding in his throat. This wasn't a delay. It wasn't hesitation. It was a decision, a deliberate erasure of what could have been a defining moment. In the middle of national heartbreak, when millions were waiting for a sign that someone in the White House understood their pain, Melania had tried to speak, and they shut her down. Again, the woman accused of coldness, of absence, had drafted some of the strongest language on racial justice any First Lady had ever written. But it never reached the podium, never reached the air. Because someone, somewhere, believed truth was too dangerous. Theo didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the screen, the glowing words blurring behind a wave of disbelief and something else. Grief. Because now he understood the full weight of the silence Jasmine Crockett had railed against. It wasn't always chosen. Sometimes it was enforced, weaponized, covered in red ink and shut behind passwords. How many other voices had been buried this way? How many people out there thought Melania never cared, when in truth, she may have cared too much for a system that demanded her obedience over her conscience? The injustice wasn't just that the speech was killed. It was that no one ever knew it existed. The world judged her based on what she didn't say. But now Theo had evidence, painfully clear evidence, that she had tried to say it, that she had put her thoughts into sentences, written in a moment when the nation was desperate for someone to show they were listening. And instead of sharing those words, the system had chosen silence. Not silence as dignity, but silence as control. Theo backed the file up immediately. 3 copies. One on an encrypted drive, one printed and locked away, one sent to his editor under the subject line. This is the second one, and it's worse. He didn't know what the fallout would be, but he knew this. Jasmine Crockett's fire had cracked something open, and this forgotten document was the fuel waiting to ignite it. The truth wasn't done speaking, not by a long shot. As Theo's revelations tore through headlines and reframed a nation's assumptions, Jasmine Crockett didn't hold a press conference, or hire a PR team, or call a strategist. She walked into her kitchen, turned on her phone, and did what no one else seemed brave enough to do. She told the truth plainly, without permission and without polish. There was no script, no prepared statement, just Jasmine Crockett standing in the small, quiet kitchen of her Dallas apartment. Her hoodie was slightly wrinkled, her face bare. The light above the stove flickered once. The phone, propped against a chipped ceramic mug, began recording. She took a deep breath. No dramatic music, no flag, just silence, heavy as stone. And then she spoke, not with the booming confidence of a stage politician, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who was done watching powerful people get erased behind the excuse of decorum. I keep hearing that I went too far, she began, voice steady but low, like she was talking directly to one person. That I should have chosen my words more carefully, that I crossed a line. She tilted her head slightly, eyes sharp, like she was looking straight through the screen. But nobody wants to talk about the line we already crossed the moment kids were crying in cages and no one with power said a damn thing. Her hand rested on the counter as she leaned forward. If the First Lady of the United States couldn't speak her mind, if she was told to shut up, sit down, smile for the Christmas tree, then what chance does my mama have? She paused. The moment swelled with quiet pressure. My mother was a school nurse for 30 years, a damn good one. I watched her stand there while angry parents screamed in her face during COVID, called her a liar, a sheep, a threat. She didn't scream back. She didn't quit. She went back to work the next day and the next day after that, because that's what we do. We survive. We swallow it. Jasmine's voice cracked, just for a moment, but she didn't stop. She told me once, being right doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it makes you a target. And I've carried that with me for years. Then came the words that would be quoted for days, printed on posters, stitched onto jackets, spray painted on protest walls. Silence is not neutral. Silence is choosing a side. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words landed like thunder in a still room. The camera kept rolling. We keep acting like staying quiet makes us polite, makes us noble. No, it makes us complicit. If you saw kids locked in chain-link cages and said nothing, if you watched women being mocked and laughed at and stayed silent, if you disappeared every time things got ugly but showed up for the photo op, then you made a choice, and that choice had consequences. She blinked hard. I'm not mad at Melania. I'm mad at a system that told her, you're only allowed to speak if your words protect the powerful. There was no applause, no dramatic exit, just a final line, whispered but sharp as glass. If they can shut her up, what do you think they've already done to the rest of us? She reached for the phone and tapped stop. The video hit 2.6 million views in under 12 hours. But those were just numbers. The real impact showed up in places the algorithm couldn't measure. In a diner in Ohio, a waitress passed her phone to a cook and said, "Watch this. She's saying what you were yelling about last week." In a break room in Fresno, 3 janitorial staff huddled around a cracked Android, watching Jasmine on repeat. One of them whispered, "I didn't even know we were allowed to talk like that." A bus driver in D.C. reposted the video with a caption, "I've been quiet for 17 years, not anymore." The hashtags exploded. Nesh silence is aside, Desh Crockett in, the kitchen, Dashi hoodie truth. But this wasn't just digital noise. This was oxygen for people who had been choking on quiet for decades. Jasmine's words didn't feel like a viral moment. They felt like a breach, a crack in the dam. Because her kitchen looked like theirs. Her mother sounded like theirs. Her frustration wasn't polished or rehearsed or dipped in consultant-approved language. It was the kind of truth that sat on your chest and refused to move. Some commentators tried to spin it. "She's politicizing trauma," one anchor said. But even his co-host looked away, lips pressed tight. Because deep down, everyone knew. This wasn't politics. This was personal. This was someone finally saying in public what so many had whispered in private bathrooms, in locked cars, in sleepless kitchen conversations across the country. We are tired of being told our silence is grace. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett's kitchen became the loudest room in America. After the kitchen video shattered the line between public silence and private survival, the noise outside only grew louder. But inside Mar-a-Lago, something broke. For the first time since it all began, Melania Trump didn't issue a press release. She didn't write a statement. She picked up her phone and dialed the number that scared her most, not because it belonged to an enemy, but because it belonged to the one person who saw straight through the quiet. The phone buzzed in Jasmine Crockett's hand just past 10:17 p.m. Her apartment was still. Lights dimmed. The only sound a low hum from the street below. The screen flashed unknown caller. She almost let it go. She didn't need another reporter, another voice asking her to explain what she had already laid bare. But something in her gut told her to answer. She swiped. "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice, softer than she remembered from the debates and camera flashes, but unmistakably direct. "This is Melania Trump." Jasmine stood up from the couch, suddenly wide awake. "I assume you've seen the video," Jasmine said. No small talk, no guard down. "I have," Melania replied, calm but not emotionless. "That's why I'm calling." The silence between them was thick, full of things unsaid. Then Melania continued, slower this time. "I don't hate you, Congresswoman. I hate the truth you said out loud." Jasmine sat back down, not blinking. "I didn't say it to hurt you," she said, her voice flat but steady. "I said it because it was real, because too many of us don't get to sit in silence and still be safe." Melania exhaled, a faint tremor in her voice. "You said I disappeared, that I only showed up for photo ops, that I chose image over responsibility." Jasmine cut in gently but firmly. "I didn't name you. But if the shoe fits, maybe it's time to stop blaming the mirror." Melania didn't respond right away. On the other end of the line, she was pacing, barefoot, wrapped in a shawl, gripping the edge of a marble table like it might steady her past. "I wanted to speak," she finally said. "There were drafts. Words I wrote. They told me it wasn't my place, that I'd embarrass the office." Her voice tightened. "And I listened. I listened because I was raised not to challenge the man I married, because I thought silence was strength." Jasmine's tone didn't rise, but it deepened. "And how many women paid the price for that silence, Melania? How many mothers, how many daughters, how many little girls saw you standing next to cruelty and thought, maybe kindness is just decoration?" For a long moment, neither spoke. Just the sound of breath, carried between cities. Then Melania whispered, "You embarrassed me. Not because you lied, but because you said the thing I couldn't." Jasmine didn't soften, but her next words carried weight, not judgment. "I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to understand why I couldn't be quiet, why silence felt like betrayal." Melania said nothing, but the absence of protest spoke volumes. Jasmine continued, lower now. "You had a platform, so did I, but only one of us got to use it without being told we were too loud, too angry, too much." Melania's reply was almost a confession. "I wasn't strong enough." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about choosing to speak even when you are." Another silence passed, this one heavier, more intimate. "I didn't call to fix this," Melania said quietly. "And I know I can't erase what wasn't said. But I wanted to hear it from you, unfiltered, not from a tweet, not from a clip, just from you." Jasmine let that land. She leaned her head back, staring at the ceiling. "Then hear this," she said finally. "It was never just about you. It was about a system that teaches women to smile through pain. That makes silence look like class and honesty look like rage. The call didn't end with forgiveness. There were no promises, no fake unity, just two women holding the weight of their choices in a conversation that neither expected, but both needed. And when Jasmine finally hung up, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt the ache of truth, that strange mixture of justice and sorrow. Not a victory, but a reckoning. And across the country, if anyone had been able to listen in on that call, they wouldn't have heard a fight. They would have heard something far more dangerous to power. Two women refusing to lie. The phone call didn't end in harmony, but it cracked something open. And sometimes the first crack is all it takes for light to break through. What happened next wasn't part of any plan, because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. The auditorium at the Columbus Community Center wasn't meant for national moments. It had peeling paint, humming ceiling lights, and a faint smell of old coffee lingering in the carpet. But that morning, it felt like something bigger than the space it held. Nearly 200 people filled the room: teachers, nurses, college students, retired women who'd come with folded lawn chairs just in case the plastic ones gave out. Jasmine Crockett had been speaking for 15 minutes, pacing with fire in her words, pulling nods and quiet gasps from the room. Her voice echoed over a portable sound system as she said, "We're told to keep our heads down. That rage makes us unlikable. That truth makes us impolite. But if you've ever been the only woman in the room trying to hold it all together, then you know, quiet doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means prison." That's when the back doors opened. At first, no one recognized her. The lights in the back were dim, and her coat was plain, deep gray, almost black, falling past her knees like a shadow. She walked without a security detail, without a smile, without the usual flash that came with her last name. But when she stepped into the light, gas rippled through the room like cold air rushing under a door. Jasmine turned her head instinctively, her sentence trailing off mid-thought. People stood. Not out of applause, but because no one wanted to be caught sitting if this moment meant something. And it did. Melania Trump didn't say a word as she walked down the aisle. She didn't meet every eye, but she didn't avoid them either. She moved like a woman carrying something heavy: grief, shame, maybe just truth that had taken too long to name. Jasmine stood still, gripping the sides of the podium, her body tense, not in anger but in readiness. A staffer moved to intercept Melania halfway up the steps, unsure if this was planned. Jasmine shook her head once. "Let her through." A second mic was handed to Melania without ceremony. She didn't take the stage like a guest. She took it like someone returning to a place she never expected to stand. For several seconds, she said nothing. The room held its breath. Then she spoke, low, almost too soft for the mic to catch. "For years," she began, her accent unvarnished, "I chose safety." Her hand trembled just once as she held the mic tighter. "I chose silence. I chose to wait, to smile, to pretend I was not drowning." Eyes locked on her. She paused, swallowed. "But today I choose truth." The sound of a single person standing echoed from the back. Then another, then another. The room didn't erupt. It rose, slowly, with reverence, with tears. A teacher in the third row covered her mouth, tears spilling before she knew they'd arrived. A social worker clutched the hand of the woman next to her. The applause didn't crash in. It gathered like a storm about to break, quiet but impossible to ignore. Jasmine remained still. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Her eyes were fixed on Melania. Not as an adversary, not even as an ally, as a witness. Melania's voice grew stronger. "You may not forgive my silence. That is fair. I do not ask you to. But I came here today not to rewrite the past. I came because I have spent too long letting others speak for me. And I have paid for it. Quietly. Alone." She turned slightly, facing Jasmine. "What you said hurt because it was true. I wasn't erased by you. I was erased long before. And for once, I want to be the one who shows up not for photos, not for approval, but for truth." Still, Jasmine didn't speak, but her hand, slow, deliberate, rested on the podium beside Melania's. They didn't embrace, they didn't pose, but the image froze in every heart in the room, Two women who had once stood worlds apart now standing shoulder to shoulder, not in agreement, but in defiance of silence. And for one quiet, suspended moment, the whole room stood with them. Not because they were told to, but because it felt like somehow history was being rewritten. Not in policy, not in power, but in presence. Two women, one stage, and a truth finally too loud to ignore. The photograph of Jasmine Crockett and Melania Trump standing side by side spread faster than any soundbite could. It wasn't just an image, it was a rupture. And within hours, that rupture became a reckoning. Far beyond Ohio, far beyond politics, far beyond the women who stood on that stage. By sunrise, the image was everywhere. On front pages, Instagram stories, cable news tickers, and personal blogs. Jasmine Crockett in her signature dark blazer, one hand resting lightly on the podium. Melania Trump in a plain gray coat, her face solemn, eyes unguarded. Neither woman smiled. That was part of what made it so striking. No choreography, no scripted embrace, just two women, one forged in fire, the other freed by it, standing shoulder to shoulder, unflinching before the eyes of a nation that had never seen anything quite like it. And the headlines reflected that rupture. The New York Times called it a new language between opposites. Politico's headline screamed, "From firestorm to fault line." But it was The Atlantic that gave it history, a handshake between candor and redemption. The public response was immediate and overwhelming, not just in clicks or hashtags, but in voice memos, handwritten letters, classroom debates, church sermons. A retired librarian in Iowa uploaded a Facebook post at 6:12 a.m. with a caption that read, "I'm 76. I've waited a lifetime to see two women stand in truth without one being erased." A college senior at Spelman tweeted, "This is the kind of womanhood I was raised for. Not perfection, just courage." The floodgates had opened, not with outrage, but with relief, as if millions had been holding their breath and didn't know it, until two women exhaled on stage and made it okay to speak again. And then came the former first ladies. Michelle Obama broke the silence first, not with a press tour, not with a speech, but with a single piercing post. Sometimes silence is survival, but it should never be permanent. The post included a black and white photo from 2009, her standing quietly behind the Resolute desk, while others in the room debated a policy she publicly never addressed. The caption beneath it read simply, "I remember." It went viral in under 20 minutes. Then Hillary Clinton joined. In a long-form op-ed titled, "When Your Voice Costs You," she recounted the early 90s when advisors told her she was too visible as First Lady, too policy-driven, too unlikable. "I wasn't trying to dominate the room," she wrote. "I just refused to disappear into it." Even Laura Bush, typically quiet, classically restrained, released a rare public message. Even in silence, we feel the weight of what we cannot say. Sometimes the cost of being First Lady is not dignity, it's your voice. What followed wasn't just media frenzy, it was a movement. One not defined by a party or a platform, but by a shared ache finally spoken aloud. On TikTok, Gen Z creators started remixing Jasmine's kitchen video and Melania's statement into a new campaign. Rashi, speak even if you shake. In universities from Ohio State to Howard to UCLA, women gathered for flash forums called voice circles, safe spaces where they could stand up and say what they'd buried under years of trying to be agreeable, professional, or polite enough. No cameras, just voice. Journalists called it post-political feminism, but for the women who felt it, lived it, survived it, it wasn't a trend. It was oxygen. It was the first time in a long time that women saw not just representation, but reckoning. Not just power, but accountability. They weren't asking to be liked anymore. They were asking to be heard. And Jasmine Crockett had become the accidental architect of it all. Not by winning a debate, but by refusing to accept a world where silence passed as grace. Through it all, Jasmine didn't hold press conferences. She didn't do interviews on late-night talk shows. She kept moving. Town halls, youth centers, legal clinics. Her voice the same one that had echoed in that kitchen, calm but cutting, still unapologetically direct. But something had shifted. When she entered a room now, the room leaned in. Teachers greeted her with tears in their eyes. Girls in hoodies clutched notebooks and waited hours just to say thank you. Even her critics, those who once labeled her too emotional or too divisive, began changing their tone. Because she was no longer just the woman who called out silence. She was the woman who turned it into thunder. The headlines and hashtags had finally settled into a low, steady roar. But inside the packed ballroom of Akron Civic Hall, the air trembled with a tension that felt like a live wire waiting for a single spark. The chandeliers overhead buzzed faintly, casting fractured light across 1,000 upturned faces as Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage and let the hush fall heavy around her before saying even one word. She wore no blazer today, only a fitted charcoal dress and a simple lapel pin shaped like an open mouth. And the symbol alone drew murmurs of recognition from the front rows. Every seat was filled. Teachers, machinists, students, corporate managers, grandmothers clutching programs they had folded and unfolded a dozen times on the ride in. Two sign language interpreters positioned near the footlights mirrored her inhalation, fingers poised like divers just before the plunge. Journalists crowded a narrow platform at the back, camera lenses trained on a podium left deliberately unbranded, because truth, Jasmine insisted, should never come wrapped in a logo. Even the stage design felt stripped. A black riser, one mic, no slideshow, no slick graphics, only raw presence. The audience, primed by weeks of viral clips and televised showdowns, expected fire. But Jasmine began with something quieter. Stillness. She let that stillness stretch until it throbbed in every chest. And when the first cough rippled from the balcony, she raised a palm and the cough died mid-breath. Then, voice steady, she began. Before you leave here tonight, I want you to recognize the sound of a voice that's free. Free from apology, free from permission, free from the weight of silence we mistake for grace. The crowd leaned forward, but Jasmine's next words curled like smoke, soft yet searing. Melania is not my enemy. She is my mirror, and both of us were asked to vanish in two different languages. A collective inhalation swept the hall, the kind that swells 1,000 lungs at once, a tidal gasp of recognition that echoed off the rafters. Jasmine walked the length of the stage, heels clicking in a rhythm that matched her cadence, and described one language as velvet, the language of be quiet and smile, spoken in mansions and motorcades, while the other was steel, the language of be quiet or else, spoken in courtrooms and grocery store parking lots. She explained how each language carried the same command in different dialects. Disappear for our comfort, swallow your rage for our image. Let history remember you as decoration or not at all. Every sentence dropped like a hammer, but landed as revelation, and women in the aisles nodded, some with arms folded tight as if holding collapsed years of their own unsaid words. Jasmine's eyes swept the upper mezzanine, catching the faces of men who had come out of curiosity and now sat motionless, jaws set, absorbing the indictment without a name tag to hide behind. I did not come to crucify a former First Lady, she declared, voice rising one measured notch. I came to crucify the myth that silence is civility, that vanishing is virtuous, that a woman's voice is a weapon only when it embarrasses power. Murmurs swelled into full-throated applause, but she cut it off with a quick slice of her hand. She had more to say, and the roar subsided like waves obeying the moon. Then Jasmine told a story the cameras hadn't captured. The night an exhausted nurse, her mother, came home after a 12-hour shift, peeled off shoes soaked in disinfectant, and confessed she was reprimanded for asking the hospital to translate discharge instructions into Spanish. The audience leaned closer, the older women in the front clutching each other's sleeves as if bracing for an old familiar blow. Jasmine's mother had stayed silent, she recounted, because arguing would have risked her job and the mortgage, and by extension, Jasmine's college dreams. That long-ago silence, chosen out of necessity, had wrapped itself around their family's future, like ivy around brick. Silence paid our bill, Jasmine said, voice trembling, but it charged us interest in regret. Heads bowed, some hands covered mouths, and the interpreter's fingers flew, translating anguish into motion that looked almost like fire flickering in midair. Jasmine paused, throat tight, then added, "So when I say Melania is my mirror, I do not absolve her. I indict the building that handed each of us a muzzle and called it jewelry." The metaphor struck sparks in every corner of the hall, and a row of teenagers in school hoodies rose instinctively, as if the floor had tilted beneath them. Jasmine allowed the applause now, but only for 3 heartbeats, then pressed on. If the system can mute a woman draped in privilege and another wrapped in hard-earned grit, then silence isn't just a habit, it's an economy. The line hit like sirens in the distance, getting too close to ignore, and the cameramen at the back exchanged glances. Scripts written that morning were already obsolete. The ceiling lights seemed to brighten, but it was only the audience, many now wiping tears, reflecting more of the stage glow back toward the podium. That was when the retired teacher rose from the 15th row, silver hair pinned in a tight bun, tears streaking the contour of her cheeks, voice trembling but clear enough to cut the hush. "You make me wish I had spoken 30 years sooner." Her words were not a question, but Jasmine answered anyway, stepping to the stage edge, hands open. "We can't rewrite yesterday," she said, "but we can refuse to leave today unwritten." The teacher's shoulders buckled with a sob she tried to stifle, and strangers on either side reached out, folding her into an embrace that looked like a living bridge between generations. Reporters scribbled furiously, but their pens seemed too small for the enormity of the moment. Lenses fogged as cameramen fought the urge to wipe their eyes and lose the shot. Jasmine let the silence expand again, as if grief and resolve were equal parts oxygen, then lifted her gaze to the balcony where latecomers crowded every railing. "Some of us carry silence like heirloom china," she said, "passed down from mothers who believed shattered dreams were louder than shattered plates." Gasps fluttered through the auditorium. No one had ever put that fear into words so plainly. Jasmine's voice softened to a whisper, amplified by pin-drop quiet. "But an heirloom can be broken on purpose, so no daughter has to inherit its weight." The line detonated in slow motion. Shock, then recognition, then applause that rolled forward like thunder chasing its own echo. Jasmine didn't smile. She looked relieved, as if dropping a burden she'd carried her whole life. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and delivered the final statement that would headline broadcast from Seoul to São Paulo. "It is never too late to raise your voice, and it is never too late to learn how to listen." The words hung in the rafters like choir notes, vibrating through bodies, settling into bones. Then the dam broke. People stood en masse, applause cascading, tears falling without shame, strangers gripping strangers with the ferocity reserved for crisis survivors meeting in the daylight. Flashbulbs strobed, capturing faces mid-cry, mid-cheer, mid-conversion. On stage, Jasmine stepped back from the mic, letting the noise wash over her, eyes shimmering but unbroken, shoulders squared as if she belonged to the moment and the moment belonged to history. Somewhere in the roar, the retired teacher's voice rose again, only this time with laughter wound through tears, and Jasmine answered with a nod that felt like a promise sealed in granite. Cameramen zoomed out, framing a tableau of jubilant chaos, fists in the air, cheeks stained, mouths open mid-shout, all beneath a banner that now seemed prophetic rather than promotional. Women in power. In that storm of sound, Jasmine didn't wave or bow. She simply placed one hand over her heart, a signal that said, "I hear you," louder than any microphone ever could. And for the first time in a long, bitter season, the nation watching believed her. When the lights in Akron dimmed and the cheers dissolved into exhausted silence, what lingered was not the memory of a headline or the flash of a camera. It was a question that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath every rib. What do we do with truth once it finally breaks its chains? The first lesson is brutal in its simplicity. Silence is a weapon that leaves no visible wounds, and that is why the world so often mistakes it for peace. Jasmine Crockett learned this in courtrooms where her objections were called dramatic, while Melania Trump felt it in ballrooms where her quiet compliance was labeled class. Two women on opposite ends of power were wounded by the same blade, but the scars looked different, one like a public bruise, the other a private bruise no camera could capture. Injustice thrives on that difference. counting on us to compare bruises instead of naming the hand that struck them both. So when Jasmine finally ripped away the veil, she forced the nation to see that the comfort of polished quiet is purchased with someone else's oxygen. Power is hazardous material. Handle it silently, and the radiation seeps into every life it touches. Confront it loudly, and it detonates in the open, where everyone can see the fallout. The lesson is not that speaking costs nothing. It is that silence builds compound interest and always collects. And in a system that monetizes female compliance, your mute button isn't just a setting, it's a shackle. The morale, sharpened by every tear in Akron, is clear. The debt of silence will bankrupt you even if the world calls it grace. The second lesson charges in like a late-night siren. Truth will always find a courier, and sometimes that courier looks nothing like a hero. Theo Padron was a cub reporter in shoes with cracked soles, yet his discovery turned keyboards into fault lines and carved new routes for courage to travel. His story reminds us that dismantling injustice rarely begins on marble steps. It starts in fluorescent basements, in cluttered offices, in the hands of people no headline cares to name. Systems depend on the myth that small people can't move big stones, and Theo shattered that myth with a single upload. Each of us holds at least one fragment of a story that can rewrite the whole. The ethical question isn't whether you're big enough to carry it, but whether you're brave enough to drop it at the nation's feet. Moral courage rarely comes with a podium. You build it under flickering bulbs and against deadlines that don't offer overtime pay. And when that courage collides with injustice, it sounds like a crack before the avalanche. The human takeaway is unforgiving but liberating. Your silence does not make you safe, it makes you complicit. Your voice does not make you invulnerable, it makes you necessary. History is not written by giants, it is assembled by 1,000 tiny hammers, striking the same wall until daylight pours through. Third, the Akron stage teaches that redemption is not a trophy you win. It is a labor you live, and it costs every step you take after apology. Melania's walk down that aisle felt short in distance, but eternal in consequence. Every heel strike echoed years of swallowed words returning to demand interest. Her admission, "I chose safety," was not absolution, but indictment, against a culture that rewarded her for vanishing and punished her for appearing with a voice. Redemption is heavy because it drags the ghosts of every moment you stayed seated while injustice stood tall. To carry it, you must acknowledge each ghost by name. That is why the room wept. They weren't applauding a perfect turnabout. They were witnessing the weight of overdue truth, crushing the myth that elegance equates to virtue. The moral is fierce but fair. Forgiveness is never free, and the receipt is printed on the next brave sentence you speak aloud. If you want the praise, take the pressure. If you crave the platform, bear the burden. Anything less is costume. Redemption, in its most human form, is a daily decision to be uncomfortable so that someone else can finally breathe. The Akron crowd understood that discomfort, and in understanding, they unlocked their own small rebellions. Fourth, injustice is an ecosystem, not an event. If you pull one lie into the light, the entire forest of falsehood starts to wither. Jasmine's kitchen video dragged one silent first lady into daylight, but its shockwave rattled boardrooms, living rooms, and classrooms because people recognized their own muzzle in Melania's. When Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Laura Bush broke their years-long tactful quiet, they were not just commiserating, they were testifying to the systemic vines that climb every position of power and squeeze the breath from it. A chain breaks fastest at its weakest link, but injustice hides by disguising every link as the weakest. Once revealed, the chain snaps in multiple places at once. The moral is strategic. Expose one truth ruthlessly, and you create fractures where empathy can seep in and rot the entire machinery of silence. That's why the Akron speech felt like an earthquake. Aftershocks rippled into laundromats, subway cars, late-night nursing shifts, places where power rarely looks. Every story that followed carried the same subtext. If she can stand there and speak, what excuse do I have? The ecosystem of suppression cannot survive a mass refusal to photosynthesize fake civility. Fifth, a movement becomes unstoppable the moment it stops begging for seats and starts building new tables. Post-political feminism wasn't drafted on legal parchment. It was sketched in hashtags, sidewalk chalk, and hastily assembled voice circles in dormitories. The moment women realized they could stand without permission, the architecture of permission itself began to crumble. Jasmine didn't appoint herself leader. The crowd anointed her, not with titles, but with the expectation that she would keep dismantling the ceiling she'd already cracked. The moral, raw as gravel underfoot, warns. Power never vacates peacefully. It has to be evicted, plank by plank, myth by myth. And if you wait for an invitation to that demolition, you will die in the waiting room of respectability. Akron proved that leadership is not charisma alone. It is consistency under fire. It is the willingness to bleed reputation so that others may live in truth. Jasmine's ascension from critic to catalyst underscores the rule. Momentum belongs to those who show up after the cameras leave, sleeves rolled, ready to sweep the broken glass they helped shatter. Sixth, injustice adapts, which means resistance must evolve faster. Within 48 hours of Akron, cable panels tried to recast Jasmine's speech as divisive theatrics, and think piece authors labeled Melania's statement a calculated rebrand. But narrative parasites cannot thrive without hosts, and for once the hosts refused to feed them. Social media users flooded comment sections with first-hand stories, drowning cynicism in lived testimony. The human lesson is tactical. You cannot outrun a lie, but you can starve it of oxygen by flooding the air with undeniable truths. Every retweeted clip, every lunch break conversation, every grandma who dared speak in a church group accelerated the story faster than spin doctors could sand it down. Failure of imagination is the last refuge of oppression. Akron forced the public to imagine a world where a first lady and a firebrand could stand in discordant unity. And once imagined, it could not be unseen. The counter-strike against injustice is not just louder noise, it is sharper clarity. And clarity, once distributed, is a contagion that no system of suppression has yet managed to quarantine. Finally, the story leaves us with a countdown disguised as an invitation. What will you say before the next muzzle finds you? Injustice is already writing new scripts, drafting fresh ways to dress silence as sophistication. But Akron armed you with a counterspell. Truth said aloud, over and over, until the lie loses its echo. The human lesson beats like a drum. You don't need a podium. You need intent. You don't need a million followers. You need one sentence that terrifies complacency. You don't need permission. You need breath, and you already have that. Every injustice is hoping you'll forget how this story felt in your chest. That heat, that tremor, that unstoppable rise of, I could have been louder. If you remember nothing else, remember that feeling. It is a fuse waiting for your spark. And if you ever fear your voice is too small, recall the worn shoes of a rookie reporter and the cracked voice of a retired teacher. Proof that the smallest stones still start avalanches. The film ends when the credits roll, but real life isn't a theater. The lights don't come back up until you stand and speak. Jasmine's final words echo into that darkness, not as comfort but as command. It is never too late to raise your voice, and never too late to learn how to listen. Whatever you do next, whisper it, shout it, sing it. Just don't let the silence write your story. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.